Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak in such a marvellous location. It doesn't often that you get to speak. And for those who haven't seen it as well, the best camera stands you've ever seen. I don't think I've seen such good camera stands in my life. They're high quality ones. Thank you as well for the opportunity to talk something about Twickenham Park. It's a stately house that doesn't exist anymore. And so why is it of interest? Well, it's of interest obviously because it's local. I think it's also of interest because it's an example of a house like many other houses that's gone, but just some of the stories of the people who lived in it, who have been through it, and the impact that they have had on the world is very important. And it happens as well that it also was, like much of Twickenham of course, an epicentre of gardening history. Twickenham has so much, including here in Marble Hill, but in other places. Twickenham has been such a key place in gardening history. And so I'm going to tell some of the stories of some of the gardens that were in Twickenham Park. But first of all, let's define Twickenham Park. What are we talking about? So here we have a modern map with the Richmond Bridge here, the 316 and the Twickenham Bridge there. And the main bit of Twickenham Park is actually that bit that goes along Richmond Road, St Margaret's Road, all the way up St Margaret's Road to the River Crane. That tear-shaped drop is basically Twickenham, is the basis of Twickenham Park. And of course, in subsequent times, many of the landlords had other land, and as we'll hear, Thomas Vernon actually had Marble Hill land down here as well. So, these boundaries are not like rigid boundaries, but this is the epicentre of Twickenham Park that we will be talking about. And the estate really started back with Richard, Earl of Cornwall. Richard, Earl of Cornwall is one of those people in history whom I think should probably be more considered than he in fact is. He was the brother of Henry III. I don't know if any of you know 1066 and all that. Henry III was not a good king. Richard, Earl of Cornwall, was in many ways the grown-up in the house of all of this one. He was the brother of Henry III. He was dispatched down as a boy to be educated in Corfe Castle, where he was dispatched with a tutor, a washerwoman, and 2 trumpeters, which says something about the importance of people in those days. And he was educated in Corfe Castle, and as a result of that, he was the first member of the royal family since the Norman conquest to speak English. He was rather bizarrely elected King of the Germans in 1256. He was elected King of the Germans because none of the German princelings trusted each other, and the one thing they were united on is that they didn't want a Frenchman. It was probably also helped by the fact that he bribed them considerably. He was incredibly rich because he had all of the lead mines down in Cornwall, and that got him a lot of money. And he also then became basically a banker to the rich people. Famously, he even turned the Pope down for a loan because he didn't have enough collateral. If the Pope doesn't have collateral, who does? There's something to point, and that's his coat of arms there. Bits of that coat of arms you might recognise now. Take the red lion out, and you've got Dutchy originals. And so in actual fact, that's his coat of arms. Actually, those were Poix from he was Count of Poitiers as well. And the outside bit of his coat of arms became the coats of arms of Cornwall, and therefore Duchy of Cornwall originals. He was given this area, the whole area of what was then called the Warreners Staines, which would have included all of this area, all the way up to Staines, and he enclosed what was then called Isleworth Park. Names change all the time, but we won't bother about it. And he enclosed it with a ditch and a warren, and he built a manor house in Isleworth, which is quite a large manor house. It had 3 chimneys and a moat. And he also built one of the first coney warrens in the country, a rabbit warren in the country. There were lots of rabbit warrens. We still have the names of some of the rabbit warrens in Warren Park, and sometimes that road, the path down the road is called Warren Run. Him and his brother Henry III actually moved rabbit warrens from islands like Brownsea Island onto the mainland, and that was also a good source of meat and also of fur. He was a really big political operator in his time. As I said, he was incredibly wealthy. He participated as well in the Civil War with Simon de Montfort. We often think of Simon de Montfort as being the sort of outsider rebel. load of rubbish. Simon de Montfort was actually married to Henry III's and Richard's sister. He was part of the family. This was a family strife as much as anything else. But Simon de Montfort, Richard was very good at playing both sides. Well, Richard was very good at playing his side, whoever that was. And he would take whoever side he was. And Simon de Montfort actually camped in Twickenham Park in 1263 with 250 knights while he was threatening Henry III in London. A year later, however, the tide turned and the Constable Tower and the inhabitants of London came out, walked out to Isleworth and burnt down his manor house and destroyed his coney warren and also destroyed his fish warren. And he then became implacably opposed to Simon de Montfort and took part in the Battle of Lewes, in which he was rather ignominiously captured, hiding in a windmill. But you know that was him. What do we know about the gardens he had? Well, we don't know a lot about his gardens. We know here. We know he was a clean gardener. His second wife was Sancha of Provence, who was very keen on gardening. We know he built some gardens in Cornwall. He built a very magical garden in Cornwall that was on an island trying to reimagine Arthurian legends. His brother Henry III did that one. But we do know something about what gardens were like in those days. And this was a typical garden in those days. It was within the walls. You can see here two pictures slightly later, but they would have been very similar here. Within the walls of the castle, you can see the castle outside. And you can see the garden was very much the province of the women. So a castle or a manor house or a royal house would be in a large, busy, smelly, lots of people place. And this was a place where you could retreat as a woman and do your own thing. So here you can see this woman, she's doing her needlework, she's sitting on a bench of grass, and she's surrounded by little flowering plants. And here we have a garden. Again, you can see it's the province of the woman, because here with this woman in green actually has the key to the garden and is leading the man into the garden. It's the women's area, and in this area you can play musical instruments, you can talk, you can talk to each other, you can be romantic and all those things. This one, you know, you've got a fountain in the middle, very much probably, would have been inspired by the Paradise Gardens they would have seen on the Crusades. The Paradise Islamic Gardens they would have seen on the Crusades, where there was a fountain and then the land would be quartered, and there would be a fountain there. So very much like this, and we will assume that he had a garden like this. We know he built gardens like this in his other places. We know he had a vineyard here because there are accounts of the vineyard. He also would have had outside the castle gardens, he would have had areas, including in Twickenham Park, which would be more male, and that would be for hunting and chasing deer and that sort of stuff. So I'm now going to jump to Henry V. I'm afraid this is edited highlights, otherwise you will not get your cars out of the car park later, so I'm just giving you a few edited highlights. And so I'm jumping to 1415, where Henry V was here. Now, I just need to remind you, 1415 was an important year in Henry V's reign, because we find him later on that year in France, fighting the Battle of Agincourt. So this was the year where he was in France as doing it. But back in February, he lays the foundation of Zion Abbey. And this was part of his promise when he became king, to form three religious houses that would be formed to help expiate the sins of his father when his father murdered Richard II and Archbishop Scrope. And there were three religious houses he was going to form. The Carthusian monks of which he called Bethlehem, they were the charter house, they were formed on the old deer path. The Celestines from Jerusalem. Now, it seems they probably never actually managed to establish themselves, because they were actually a French order, and so what then happened for the rest of 1415 probably meant that it wasn't politic for a French order to come over to the UK. And then the Bridgetines, who were the religious house that he founded, he called it Zion, and he founded these, the Bridgetines, in Twickenham. And what do we know about the Bridgetines? Their official name is the Order of the Most Holy Saviour, and they were founded by Saint Bridget of Sweden. And what was unusual about them was that they were a mixed order, so men and women were both in the monastery, but women actually were in control. So apart from the head priest, apart from the priest, the father confessor had to be a priest, obviously, and obviously had to be a man in those days. But the abbess was in charge of the monastery, and all of the officers, apart from the father confessor, were women in the monastery, and they controlled all of the money. So it was a rather unusual place, and therefore it became quite a popular monastery for people to place their daughters in, if their daughters wished to do it. And also it got a lot of money. So it then also actually attracted the men, and it attracted the men who wished to be scholars because it had a fantastic library and resources for them to do their work. What do we know about the monastic gardens? Well, we know only what we know from other monastic gardens. We know there were 2 cloister gardens, one for the men and one for the women. And these would be cloister gardens like you see in cathedral closes now, possibly with a fountain in the middle, a lot of green, because green grass or green plants, because green was meant to be restful for the eyes, especially if you were doing close work. There was an orchard or cemetery that had 13 trees, we know that. We know that they kept an open grave in the cemetery, and every morning after terce, which was at 9 o'clock in the morning, the nuns would process out of the chapel and would stand around the open grave and would sing Psalm 130, obviously reminding themselves of their mortality. And there's a medicinal garden. I couldn't find a good picture of a monastic medicinal garden, but this is the medicinal garden. We know they had a very strong medicinal garden in Zion, and indeed when Zion was suppressed, I found a wonderful account of Zion about 50 years after it's done, and somebody did an inventory of the garden, and you can find all of these monastic herbal plants that have gone wild, and that they found. So it was an important garden that would have been important not only for looking after the nuns and the brothers, but also looking after the local population. It would be part of the local system. They didn't actually stay in Twickenham for long. They stayed in Twickenham until 1431, when they found the site too small because they were too successful, and they moved then to Isleworth, where Zion House now is, Zion Park, and they were very, very successful there. They had there the largest non-cathedral church in this country. So absolutely massive church. Obviously they were subject to the vagaries of Henry VIII. In 1535, one of their priests, St. Richard Reynolds, was martyred. His quarters were hung, or one of his quarters was hung from the gatehouse, and indeed the nuns kept the gatehouse quarter, and that's it there. It still exists, the part of the gatehouse that his quarter was hung from. In 1539 they were expelled, and they hung around in this country for a little while, and then they went over and lived in places around Antwerp and that area. Briefly came back when Mary came back onto the throne, but under Elizabeth I were expelled again. Spent some time in Rouen, but then spent a considerable period, about 250 years, in Lisbon. And in Lisbon, they actually remained they lost the men, they couldn't attract men afterwards, so they became a female only, and they remained an English and Welsh religious order. So if you were a Catholic and your daughter wished to enter a convent, and convents didn't exist in this country, they could go to Lisbon and enter this convent. And they came back to this country in about 1861, it says, 1861. Rather sweetly, they brought this back with them, and they also brought the original keys to Zion Abbey. One feels the Duke of Northumberland may have changed the keys. They've changed a lot since then. And they've moved around there. There is one of them left alive, Sister Mary Smythe, who is here with 2 of her other sisters, is still alive. Rather intriguingly, she's in the nursing home that actually my wife's great aunt was in when my wife's great aunt did. This shows actually the very distinctive Brigittine habit. They have this very unusual headdress, which is a white crown with red sacred hearts for the wounds of Christ on the interstices. She's an important figure, I think, in actually religious history in this country, because she is the last remaining religious who can point themselves and be part of a pre-Reformation order. all of the religious orders that we have now in this country were either imported from overseas or were new formation. And so she's the only one who can trace continuity to before Henry VIII. And so when she goes, that will be a link with our religious history gone. And obviously it's not very far away. Now, where was this? Everybody says up until now that this religious order was actually, the monastery was founded here. So here we have Richmond Bridge, and this is Twickenham Park. They actually owned all of this land here. I've been doing some research recently, and I think I'm afraid to disprove they weren't here. They were probably just here in what is now Cambridge Park, was actually where their convent or their monastery was. We can't prove it, but it seems the most likely place from the description of where it is, but happy to take questions on that. Okay, so I'm now going to do one of my other leaps forward in history, and I have a book which fills in some of the gaps if you're interested, and I'm going to talk now about two of the most fascinating residents of this one, and then the gardens that they made. And so, this has got to be the most distinguished resident in Twickenham Park. Indeed, I would say in Twickenham, even the people like Alexander Pope there, Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon, his CV is a good CV, Solicitor General, Attorney General, he was made a Baron, he was then made a Viscount, and then he was impeached for bribery. His defence for the impeachment of bribery was relatively straightforward. First of all, the bribery didn't influence his decision. That was possibly true because actually the people who bribed him complained that the decision went the wrong way. And also that the people who bribed him would have felt it was unfair if they hadn't been able to bribe him because he'd taken money from the other side. Seems reasonable. And his other defence was also probably reasonable. Everybody else did it. But it's not for his political career that we remember him. We remember Francis Bacon as a philosopher, and we remember him as the person who really brought forward into the Western world scientific methodology. He wasn't a very good scientist himself, he didn't do any discoveries that made anything, but if you talk to all of the early people in the Royal Society, all of the people in the Royal Society looked up to Bacon as, if you like, their founding muse. And that's because he really pushed forward two things that are key to modern natural sciences, and that's inductivism, the idea that you can take data or observations or something, and from that produce a hypothesis, induct a hypothesis. You can say, I see that all cats have 4 legs, therefore I am now going to make a hypothesis that cats have 4 legs. And that process is actually really key to science, because science works by process of induction followed by deduction. And he was a great fan of empiricism. He really promoted empiricism. So the idea that you actually gain knowledge by observation or by experimentation. Before then, knowledge was obtained by reading the Grand Masters, the Greek fathers, the early fathers of the church. And that what you were doing was you were embellishing that. But you're obviously doing that, you don't add to knowledge, and you had to do observation or experimentation to add to knowledge. He actually sometimes, scientists see him as a martyr of science because he died as a result of jumping out of his carriage one winter's night when he saw a dead chicken and stuffing the dead chicken with snow to see whether it would slow down its degradation. We don't quite know whether the experiment worked because he died as a result of a cold he caught at the time. He was also a lawyer and a judicial writer. His law was probably better known in America, where it was very much used by the Americans in helping produce the American legal system. He was the first ever QC. He was the first Queen's Counsel, so he was actually called on to advise Queen Elizabeth. And again, he used induction in his... he believed that you could go from common law and produce theories of law based on that induction. Some people, I think people who are on the edge of sanity, think that he wrote Shakespeare's plays, which if he did, Shakespeare's plays were written in Twickenham. But, we won't do that one. But what did he use Twickenham Park as? He used Twickenham Park as a bolt hole. He spent his term time in London, in the Inns of Court, where he lived, and then he came here in the holidays and went over there and was playing, and he did his writing and his thinking here. And he did his writing and his thinking with a group of people around him, men actually. So he had a group of men, and he worked by having discussions with these men, mostly his sort of coterie, and he would talk to them, he'd discuss them, he'd argue things out, and then he would write them down. And that was his way of advancing knowledge. And he did a lot of that outside in the garden. And so, towards the end of his life, after he sold Twickenham Park, he wrote this: "Let Twickenham Park be purchased, if possible, for a residence for such deserving persons to study in, since I experimentally found the situation of this place much convenient for the trial of my philosophical conclusions." He was trying to make a university here. We would have had the third, well, there were earlier universities, but we would have had the third successful university in the country after Oxford and Cambridge. But unlike Oxford and Cambridge, which were tied into this idea of being tied to the old fathers, we would have had an experimental, we would have an imperial college here in Twickenham. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'll let you to judge. And also he was important in gardening. I mean, he wrote this essay called Of Gardens, which has perhaps the call that many gardeners still have. God Almighty first planted a garden, and indeed it is the purest of human pleasures. It is the greatest refreshment of the spirits of man, without which buildings and palaces are but gross handiworks. Wow. I mean, as a gardener, you can't say better than that, can you? So he wrote this very influential essay of gardens, and it contains the first ever suggestion in this country that you could actually have flowers and fruit throughout the year by carefully thinking about what you planted. He had geometric arrangements. He designed gardens that had pillars and arches, and he would often have bird cages. The idea was that in your garden you were assailed by all of the senses. You looked at stuff that was beautiful, you heard stuff that was beautiful, and you smelled stuff that was beautiful, and then you might even take some fruit off the tree and eat stuff that was beautiful. So all of your senses were involved in that one. You'd have a banqueting hall in the garden, because that's what I'll show you some pictures of that. You'd have fountains, so again you had music, the music of water. And he was the first person in this country to take the Italian idea of a grotto, but he actually believed that the grotto, or grottar as he called it, should be, unlike here where it's in the garden, should be in the basement of the house. So a bit like Woburn Abbey, if any of you have been there in Woburn Abbey, the grotto is under the house. And he had a heath, which was wilderness. And then also in the New Atlantis, a very important book of his, he proposed the idea of a research establishment, first ever sort of research establishment, and this was what really got the Royal Society going, and a large part of that was that it should be a horticultural research establishment. And so there are lovely pictures of people pushing wheelbarrows with strawberries as big as the wheelbarrows in it, which was his dream, that you could actually improve yields of crops by scientifically understanding how to grow them better. And that wasn't about breeding. He didn't understand about breeding at the time, but that was about when to plant them, how to manure them, thinking about how to grow them in a way that would improve their yield the most. And that was the inspiration for people like Sharrock to go off and form the botanical gardens in Oxford, which were the early gardens in Oxford. And these were more than just the horticultural gardens that you had in places like Italy, which were about cataloguing plants. These were about understanding how to grow plants better, to improve yields of things. He made a garden, which I'll talk about at the moment, but he shared this garden with the next person who owned this house, who was this lady. My wife says that there are two women that she is jealous of. This is one of them. They're both very dead. So I think she says it knowing that she is safe, so that my wandering eye is safe. But this, I must admit, if Lucy Russell was around today, my heart would be beating a little bit faster. She was Countess of Bedford. She was born Lucy Harrington. And she was a fantastically, you can see from her face, she was a feisty woman. She came into power. She married the Earl of Bedford, who was a reasonably substandard Earl-type figure. But what happened was, I don't know what it is about Twickenham. They breed feisty women. What happened was when Elizabeth I died, all of the royalty and aristocracy came to London to go to the funeral of Elizabeth and then to do the mourning period and then to decide what would happen. Everybody except Lucy and her mother. And Lucy and her mother just went straight up to Scotland and made cosy with Anne of Denmark, who was later James the First's wife. And so about 6 weeks later, the aristocracy and the government got themselves together and decided to send a delegation of 250 people up to Scotland to bring the Queen back down to London. And they all arrived, and all of these ladies in waiting arrived in Scotland, unfortunately to find that Lucy had got there first, and she had become bestest of friends with Queen Anne, and Queen Anne then sent these women away with a bit of a flea in the ear because she had her best friend, and so she became Lady of the Bedchamber, which was an incredibly powerful position. She was the most painted woman in the country apart from royalty. And her parents were rewarded by this by being made guardians of Princess Elizabeth, and they lived in Kew, and they raised Princess Elizabeth. They were her guardians. And Princess Elizabeth later went on to be the Electress Palatine and the Winter Queen of Bohemia, and actually obviously important in our royal family because that's where the Hanoverians eventually came from when we had to recreate our royal family because we ran out of suitable people. She used Twickenham Park as her place. It was actually bought for her. She wasn't allowed to own it because she was a married woman, but it was held in trust by her. And she used it to entertain, and she also used it as a patron. She was a great patron of poets. John Donne wrote poetry about her. I find his poetry pretty turgid myself, but you know, people might like it. Ben Jonson also wrote it, and John Donne wrote a poem about the garden in Twickenham Park, her garden in Twickenham Park, which many A-level students still have had to read. And she spent her time in the garden. The garden was a place where she could meet men and talk poetry and talk her philosophy with them, because it's a place where you could be, again, the house was pretty busy, you could be quiet, but also you could be seen. And because you could be seen, nobody could say you were doing anything that you shouldn't be doing. As we'll see, she was a gardener, she was a poet, she was also a Puritan, and was very strong on the Protestant church, and the Protestant church especially anti the Spanish influence of the Roman Catholic Spanish influence. And she was a great performer and instigator of masques. And so this is her in one of the masques uniform. This is the Masque of the Queens. I took part in a recreational masque in the banqueting house, where a friend of mine who's a professor of history of theatre, and he was recreating this masque. And these were events that went on all evening, and you would sit on a bench, and what would happen was that people would come and do the masque. And the masques were done by amateurs like her, stiffened by real actors. Shakespeare's group probably did a bit of masking as well, just to get the money in, and they would be stiffened by real actors, and that they would be doing some acting, some dancing, but also sometimes the whole audience would get up and dance, and there were great mechanical contrivances, and so great big things would come down from the sky and would turn around and an actor would be in it, or there would be waves in the background. They were really quite remarkable things. They spent a lot of money on it. And this is her in a costume designed by Inigo Jones, where she is acting as the Queen of the Amazons. And you can see, first of all, that the masks are quite daring short skirts. The one person wrote after one of these masks, having seen the Queen, that he was shocked that women actually had ankles. He didn't believe this was possible. But you can also see that the costume is reasonably revealing. This is reasonably revealing. She's wearing a scarf over her left breast, and that's because she is acting the Queen of the Amazons, because the legend was that the Amazons cut off their left breast in order to do their archery. And so and these were quite somewhat risque events. She left Twickenham Park in 1618. She went on to develop another garden in Moor Park, which is a very good garden. And I like this picture. This picture is in Sydney Sussex College. This was a college that her family founded. If you go and look at if you go to the college, it has her family coat of arms all over it. It's the Puritan College in Cambridge. It's well known one. This is towards the end of her life. The Queen's died She's lost her influence in court. She's turning her face to one side because she's had smallpox, and she's lost sight of her right eye, and her right side of her face is now scarred. But she's in that contemplative life, end of life sort of feeling of life. And I just think that compared to all of the other pictures where she's out there, this is actually much more contemplative. And I just like that picture of her. So what were the gardens that she and Francis Bacon had? Well, this is what a garden looked like. This is a general garden, but as garden scene that's painted somewhere between 1600 and 1610. You can see this in the Lambeth Garden Museum. And there's several things I want to show you about this. First of all, look at the outside world. It's scary. Okay? Those mountains are not, those hills are not nice places to be. And so we have a gatehouse to keep them out with big, strong crenellation on it. It's around, keeping that outside world away from it. And slightly mythical because this fence, obviously, you could jump over fairly easily, but you get that sense of keeping things out. You have these rectangles, I'll show you pictures in a moment, rectangles of grass. That's probably a water wagon on there. And then you have a banqueting house because they're on banquets, they're on benches, and you can see men and women sitting in a banqueting house, eating, drinking, chatting. And you might go to a banqueting house just for a drink and a chat, or you might go after the main meal. You might go to the banqueting house while they clear the main hall. So you have dessert in there, dessert to dessert the main hall. You might have dessert there while they clear the main hall and prepare it for the entertainments that will happen in the evening after that. You've then got people playing games, so a little bit like here you've got 9-pin bowling or whatever it is, I think, in Marble Hill. You can see they're playing a game that's sort of some derivation of a croquet-like game, and that would be quite common. You can see these two men playing. And you can also see here a man and a woman sitting together on a bench, talking. And so they can talk, they can be very close, they can be very private with each other, they could be flirting or they could be talking poetry or philosophy, but actually nobody can say nothing bad is happening because they are totally visible. Okay? So that's how gardens were very much used in those days. They were used as an extension of the house, but they were used as an extension of the house, which was probably where you could always be more private than you could be inside the house. And this was their garden. This is map made by Smithson in 1609. That was a year after Lucy bought Twickenham Park. And I'll take you through this house, this map. So there's a map, and I'll take you through bits. First of all, kitchen garden. There was a kitchen garden. It's not where we'd expect kitchen gardens later. It's very close to the house. Later on, kitchen gardens moved away from the house because they were smelly places for stuff. And even in those days, so this is a little bit later, this is by Nathaniel Bacon, cousin of Francis Bacon, but this is, and I love this garden, this picture, because this is it's in the Tate. It's a picture that makes vegetable growing sexy. That cookmaid is clearly demonstrating her fertility in various ways. But these are all plants that could have been grown in Britain and were grown in Britain. Indeed, an analysis of all of these plants shows that you could have grown these in about a 6-week period in Britain. And also what's interesting is some of these plants come from the Americas, and some of these plants actually also come from the Middle East and from Asia. And so already by this stage, you're getting fruit and plants that come from all over the country. And you might believe that these are impossible, but these are actually kraut. These are kraut ones. So you would have had them. Their heads would have been so big. You can actually see them being grown here on the manure heap. There were also these mounds, and so you have these 4 mounds, and you actually also have a raised panel there. And mounds were very common. Viewing mounds were very common in those days. The ones in this garden were about 12 to 14 steps. That makes them about 6 to 8 feet tall. And here's one. This is actually in Wadham College in Oxford, but you see them in all sorts of houses. You see them in the Kew Gardens, in the Queen's House. There's one. It's slightly sort of flattened out. But what you can see, I've just taken some photographs from the Kew one. You can see into the garden. And so one of the things that you're doing in these gardens is you're looking into the garden. Also in Kew, you can look out. And when you look out in Kew, you just see the car park, which is not very interesting. But of course, in Twickenham Park, you'd look out and you'd see the Royal Palace. And for somebody like Lucy or somebody like Francis Bacon, that would be really important, to be able to take your friends and show them the Royal Palace. That would show them your connections. And then in the middle you have this very complicated arrangement of circles and things like that. And there's various sorts of trees. So in red they are birch trees, then they are lime trees, and then the green are all fruit trees. They may have been cherries, we don't know, pears, apples, whatever. And then in the purple colour was rosemary. And that would have had several purposes. First of all, it would have made a nice hedge. Second, as you walked along, you could run your hand along the rosemary, or your clothes could go along the rosemary, and you've got the smell. And also, come washing day, when you did your spring cleaning in the spring, what you would do was you would lay your clothes out to dry on the rosemary bushes, and then they would not only be a good place to dry, but they would be impregnated with the smell that was meant to keep down the insects. Then there's some topiary on the outside, quickthorn. Now, here's a recreation in Ham House. And I've taken this photograph. People who know Ham House, you'll know that that's the bit down the side of the garden. And what I find absolutely amazing is you look at Ham House, it's got a raise, the bits around the side are raised. They're only raised about so far off the ground. There's only like a step up to them. And yet, even so, you get this sense of looking down into the garden. It looks like a little jewel. And there's nothing outside. You see, the outside world doesn't exist. This is a recreation of Kenilworth, a little bit earlier garden. This is a garden a bit earlier, but again, this obviously is. But you can see these gardens are designed to be looked down into. They're jewel-like gardens. And actually, the rest of the landscape doesn't happen. The garden ends at the fence. And here you can see actually, Kenilworth, a big birdhouse for bird song and a fountain in the middle. Queen's Garden in Kew. I really only showed this because, again, you get this sense of the pathways, but also it might well have been with the lime. They could have made arches that you could walk through. We can't tell. Now, this was a really important part, and Lucy was in a really important part of garden history. She collaborated with two people. First of all, she collaborated with her patron, Anne of Denmark. Anne of Denmark, wife of the Queen, did some really influential gardens, Somerset House and Somerset House and Greenwich. She was involved in part and used de Caus, Salomon de Caus, who was the great gardener there, who built the great garden in Heidelberg. And then also this gentleman here, Henry, Prince of Wales. And Henry, Prince of Wales, had been given Richmond Palace, and his bestest friend was John Harrington. And John Harrington was, of course, Lucy's brother. So, Lucy is right at the epicentre. She's got her brother as the bestest of friends. Look at this romance here going on here with the handsome prince and the adoring best friend. They're even dressed in the same clothes as they're doing things. And they were really close. And Henry was building a fantastic garden in Richmond. Henry, of course, was the prince whom, one of those questions in history, what if he hadn't got typhoid and he'd lived? He was a far more better specimen than his brother. His brother, things went wrong. He was a man who was also much more Puritan, much more Protestant. And so what would have happened to history if we'd had him? He was very cultured. And so what the gardens that Anne and Henry were producing were Renaissance gardens. These gardens started in Italy. You can still see them in Italy. They spread to France and then to England. They were inspired by the original Roman gardens, and they were characterised in several ways. They were characterised by making a show. They were large, they were grand, they were often symmetrical. You would have fountains. When I say you would have fountains, you didn't just have something bubbling away. They had fountains, and I'll show you. This is the fountain that Henry designed to have in Richmond, where you've got a Father Thames with a great big urn of water pouring out on an island surrounded by trees. You had mechanical water-moving devices, and so if you go to Villa d'Este in just outside Rome, there are places where you step on the paving stone and get squirted by water. You would go in and there would be mechanical birds making birdsong from you, driven by water. In the garden in Richmond, he planned to have a ball that was suspended on water that would just bounce around on water. And you would have these great big Parnassus fountains. This was one he designed, but it's also very similar to one that was built in Somerset House. And they were designed to impress, amuse, delight. And to give you an idea, these are three of my favourite in Italy. Sacro Bosco, which is just to the northwest of Rome, which is a frightening garden produced by the Colpacini. This really full of these really vivid pictures of wild faces, and you know, I've had a drink inside that. It's quite nice. You sit outside, but you've got this. You're sitting in the mouth of an ogre. The Villa d'Este, many of you will have been there, just outside Rome. Absolutely fantastic. There's a water organ up here which plays music, which actually one of my fellow immunologists' fathers restored. But just water on a massive scale, just all over the place. And then what was seen as the height of it, and there's not much of it remaining, but Pratolina Gardens, which is in the suburbs north of Florence, but the Apennine Colossus still remains. And this is what Henry was basing this figure on. That's 11.5 metres high. Those are trees. There are 3 rooms in there, and the top room you can put a fire in so he can breathe smoke. There are little tubes of water, so in the summer he sweats, and in the winter he forms icicles. That's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And we could have had that at Richmond, but we got him instead. So where did this all happen? Moses Glover's map of 1635, most of you will be aware of. Here is Richmond Ferry, where the bridge is. Here's Richmond Road, St Margaret's Road, following round down to the River Crane, exactly as we are now. Here's Sandycombe Road. You know it's there because there are very sandy sandpits there. So that main house continued. And in the middle of it here, you can see the house. Let's zoom in a bit. And this is the boundary as was then between Isleworth and Twickenham. And so you can see the house here, and this allows us to place the house very well. And so you can place the house that if this is here a modern map, so this is the 316, the house is here basically athwart St George's Road, opposite 27 and 29 St George's Road. And then there was a lake at the back of that garden, which I'll look at in a moment, which is in the back of the garden, which is roughly where the lake is in the lake pleasure grounds. This can be fairly accurately done by maps now. There were some mistakes before. But also, I was fortunate 2 years ago, in 2024, the gasworks dug up the road, and when they dug up the road, I noticed in the hole there's a wall, and Paul helped me look at some of the bricks in there and dated them tentatively to early 16th, early 17th century. So, you know, I think that's proof. Well, it's not proof, but it's certainly a strong indication. So let's look again at this house here. So first of all, let's zoom into the house here. You can see the house here. That's a typical Jacobean house. Here we have the garden that I've shown you already with the circular bits here. Here's the kitchen garden. I think by this stage it's been converted into another garden from what we can see. And then there's a big rectangular 2-acre lake at the back of the garden there. There's an orchard there, a cherry orchard. They were mad on cherry trees in those days, and at this stage it was actually owned by the Countess of Hove, who also had a massive house in Edinburgh where she had something like 250 cherry trees. It was the craze of the time. But you can see the house there and the garden it's in. So now one of my jump forwards. Charles II came back onto the throne, and gardening changed. And gardening changed because Charles II came back, having seen Versailles, and determined to stamp his authority on the land, and he did that by being Versailles-like and pulling avenues. So this is obviously Hampton Court, Bushy Park, avenues of trees radiating across the countryside, the long lakes radiating across the countryside. This is controlling nature. This is showing who is in control. The person at the time who was living there was John Lord Berkeley, who was, I think, probably a candidate for the ugliest person who's ever lived in Twickenham Park. We don't know a lot about his garden, but he did have a garden here. He entertained the king here, but he did also employ John Evelyn, the diarist, to look after his house when he was in Ireland. And John Evelyn wrote this book. It's the first book published by the Royal Society called Silver, and it was an incredibly influential book because it proposed that, for using words that not his words we would use now, for aesthetic reasons, for ecological reasons, and for industrial reasons, we should be planting trees. And millions of trees were planted as a result in this country of Silver, as a result of this book. It was incredibly influential. So we assume that some of the trees that were planted in Twickenham Park were as a result of this. We were, as a country, we grew to be very grateful for this because round about 100 and so years ago later, we cut down all of those trees to make the boats that we used to fight Napoleon with. Next person, I'll jump to somebody whom we know more about in terms of Marble Hill, was Thomas Vernon. He owned the garden, he was here in the late 1600s, early 1700s. He was a Turkey merchant, which meant that he traded in Turkey, not in turkeys. He was an MP, Lord Commissioner. He was also one of the founding directors of the South Sea Company, though in actual fact he wasn't a director at the time of the bubble, but he was a director early on. He made a lot of money out of that. He owned a lot of land around here, including Marble Hill. And he was a landlord to both Alexander Pope and to Henrietta Howard, and as far as we can tell, he was a rather not very pleasant landlord because there are various letters that show him. He got kicked out as an MP because he inappropriately tried to influence the trial of his son-in-law, who was John Slaby, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was being prosecuted for his work in the South Sea bubble, and he inappropriately tried to influence that one. So got kicked out of Parliament, but got re-elected the next year in a by-election, so that's okay. John Slaby, by the way, went off and after a very short imprisonment of a few days in the Tower of London, consoled himself by returning to his estates in Yorkshire and built what has got to be one of the most beautiful water gardens in this country in Studley Royal. It is just a fantastic water garden. So, bad things come from you. Bad things happen to you in your life. You can do good things of it. Maybe one or two people need to learn that nowadays, I don't know. But two things that Vernon did that were important in gardens. First of all, he employed this man, Batty Langley. Batty Langley was an important figure who merits at least a paragraph in garden history, because he advocated from that very stylised Charles II avenues going this way, he advocated more irregular, informal gardens with what we would call rococo, and he called arty natural landscaping. And he experimented, or he developed some of this in Twickenham Park. And so this is the sort of garden that Batty Langley designed. And you can see it's rather confused. It's got these avenues of trees, still doing that one, but it's got these sorts of twiddly pathways and things like that in them, where he's trying to be natural, but he's not quite there yet, is he? And he also made these things. So he made a spiral in Vernon's garden. He made this big spiral in Vernon's garden. So he liked making these shapes in the garden, which are, if you like, almost mathematical. If he was living today, he would love fractals and fractal geometry. He would love them. And of course, this is a precursor to Henrietta Howard's garden, which she you worked with Pope and with Bridgman for, where you still got these avenues of trees here, but now you've got pathways that are sinuous. And so they took the next step and went from Batty Langley's sort of very rigidity to these much more sinewy pathways. And so it was a step on the way here. The other thing that Thomas Vernon did was the introduction of the Salix babylonica, or weeping willow, into this country. Of course, it's not native to this country. It's native to China. It came down the Silk Route to what was then Turkey. He introduced it from Aleppo and grew it. 1748, and this is the date that most people have done, Peter Collinson noted one in Twickenham Park. And most people then argue, did Alexander Pope or did Thomas Vernon do it? I've found now a letter from Batty Langley, 1728, showing that he had a weeping willow in it there. So the weeping willow was introduced. In Twickenham, we can claim the weeping willow as the first here. Alexander Pope then made it famous by planting it beside water and writing Persian poetry about it, but What did the garden look like then? So this is the rock map of 1741. Vernon's widow is still in residence at this stage, and you can see there are fields here. You can see you've still got these slightly old-fashioned at this stage gardens with these double rows of trees here. And if you zoom in into the garden here, here's the house. You've still got the aspects of that circular garden to one side. You've got now, though, much more opened up trees going on here. You're still not connected to the outside world. I mean, we're sitting with the most beautiful view of the Thames, of Richmond Hill, of down towards Isleworth, and it's not part of the views at this stage. You've got a wilderness at the back there. And what else have you got? Well, that's probably about it. You can see it's a garden in transition. And here we can see the fields here, they were used agriculturally. So this is the prospect of Richmond. Here's Richmond Ferry, so those are the fields at one end of the garden. They were used agriculturally. And we're on the way to this one, the landscape gardening. The landscape gardening of Bridgman, Kent, Capability Brown. That stuff that we now see as quintessentially English. This is from 1786, when the Duke of Montrose was in residence. And you can see there still is an avenue of trees. You know, the best example of this sort of garden I think you see now is Zion. I always, whenever I walk up to Zion House, along that pathway to Zion House, you know, I look towards the left, and just the miracle of what Capability Brown did in that landscape. So you look to that left, and you think the landscape is going on forever, and you forget there's a road there, because he just very carefully tipped that landscape up at the edge, and that makes it just look like it's disappearing when it's not. You can't, you know, in the summer you can't see anything except the very top of the Sky headquarters in there. It's a beautiful bit of landscaping, and you can see that sort of landscaping happening here. Little rows of trees, probably a belt of trees to deal with what is now. You know, we know there was a tavern in St Margaret's, where St Margaret's Tavern now is, just hiding that. And this is what the house looked like then. So here we have the house here, and this is a typical Capability Brown landscape. No evidence Capability Brown did it, it's influenced by him. Grass all the way up to your window. And so here you can see these people there. You can just make out there's a ha-ha introduced by Bridgman, a ha-ha between here, keeping the animals away from the people. And so you can't see you can't see the boundary between the animals and the people. Again, at the back here, you've got some sheep type things here, and again you've got a ha-ha here, and so again there's no boundary there between the garden and the people. So this was about 1803. The house got knocked down in about 1810, we don't know exactly, 1807 to 1810, and this is the map we have now of moving into the later period, 1817. Gosling, a banker, had built it. Worthwhile pointing out some of the neighbours, Mr. Turner, and also Mr. Turner, where's Mr. Turner here? Mr. Turner here and Mr. Turner here. And of course, the Reverend George Cambridge, Owen Cambridge there, son of the great Cambridge. And here we have the house here. This is where the house was. It's now been knocked down. They're just outbuildings remaining. And you can see that now we have kitchen gardens here, screened from the house, which is now here. They've built a new house up here, near the river, screened from it with a nice bank of trees, and we now have a much more garden that's much more, it's not yet Victorian, but it's moving into Victorian. This is much more of a Repton-esque type garden, where you have a landscape, but you base it on the garden. So we actually have a shrubbery here, an introduction of a new type of garden called a shrubbery, and a conservatory there, which we'll look at in a moment. This is a sales catalogue, and you get the sense of this is what the house was in 1817. Large house, 10 family bathrooms, 8 bedrooms for the servants, and a full 2 water closets, well established. But you can see they're beginning to use greenhouses for here. So you've got orange trees, lemon trees, and you've also got a flower garden, you've got a rose garden, and you've got an American garden. So again, beginning to bring in things from overseas. This house was owned by the Earl of Castles, who then became, often we could say Cassilis, but it's actually Castles, who became Marquis Elsa. And he bought this house and the next door house, and he knocked it down. He was the one who actually named it St Margaret's for the first time. And at his stage, a garden was a romantic garden. This was the romantic movement. This is the time of Wordsworth and people like that. And so a garden was a place to excite the emotions. It was different from anything else. And so he built a romantic landscape which had an Arcadian garden, had a farm in it, that sort of feeling. It had large trees, cedars of Lebanon, which we talked about as being dark. He had a Gothic lodge built. There's a concavity that he planted to make it look like a Roman amphitheatre. He had a temple in it, with a jasper font. Jasper, wasn't really, but never. And then he took made an old chapel. It was probably the old stables. And he made an old chapel. He called it St. Margaret's Chapel. And you were meant to imagine that there were monks still using it. It's that sort of romantic feeling to it. And then he had this big orangery. And he had a gardener. The gardener was a great lead maker for Venus. Nothing of it very much remains except for this. Some of you will recognise this is the Rambert Ballet School. The bottom half of the round by Bala School was the orangery. And you can see that now from these windows that go all the way, or nearly down to the ground. This would have been an old orangery. Victorian times, the top was added, and you can see it doesn't quite fit. But, I'll skip that one. So, let's finish up now with, I won't spend much time talking about the Earl of Kilmurray, because I think many people have heard my Earl of Kilmurray talks. But the Earl of Kilmurray was the last owner of this area, Francis Jack Needham. Fought in the Peninsular War, most famous for, in 1843, when he was in his late 50s, eloping with Priscilla Host, a 20-year-old young lady, who unfortunately died 10 years later, and he built this magnificent Egyptian mausoleum, which, has everybody here seen the Egyptian mausoleum? If you haven't, you need to go and see it. It's the unknown secret of St. Margaret's, this Egyptian mausoleum. And he built the Egyptian mausoleum, and he'd also built a house for her to live in, what we call the second St. Margaret's house. But because she died, they never lived in it. And so he sold all of the land. So this is the house that he built for Priscilla down here. And he sold the house and all of the land associated with the house to the Conservative Land Society. And the Conservative Land Society existed in order to give people who didn't have property. And so they organised, they divide the land up into 3 parks and actually to other areas as well, divide into plots and then sold the plots to individuals on the basis that they didn't already own the house, that they would build a house worth, I think it was £250, and they would give people mortgages for doing that. And the idea behind that was that in those days we all think women didn't have the vote, they didn't have the vote, but most men didn't have the vote either. You had to be a landowner to have a vote. And therefore what they were doing is they were enfranchising men, and they were enfranchising men that they thought would vote Conservative. Hence the title, the Conservative Land Society. And so this was an attempt to win Conservative votes over by building land. And the parks still exist, and so this is an old postcard of the park, but the parks still exist there. And so this is, if you like, almost the last remnant. This is on the site of that big 2-acre lake that I showed you before. These are, these trees, this bridge was probably put in by the Marquis of Elsa over the lake, and there are 2 of those. And so there is still a little bit of this still surviving. So I'll stop there and thank you, and I will do a plug because I have written a book about this, and you've got the edited highlights. I don't expect only if you are somebody who's really interested in this do it, but we're selling it for, did offer a discount, but the Marble Hill Society have taken the discount to suggest that that should go towards their funds. And so if you buy it, you will be supporting Friends of Marble Hill. So please do that. I'm not going to say please buy it, but please feel good about supporting the Friends of Marble Hill if you do that. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much.